Story time about how I lied to my parents about having a boyfriend for 4 years. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My parents are super strict. Growing up, I could not have any guy friends. I wasn't even allowed to go over to my girlfriends' houses. At school, I was pretty popular, and the fact that my parents didn't let me have any boyfriends made the boys actually want me more, which is something my dad actually hated. Boys would call our house asking to talk to me, and my dad would grill me about it. So I finally decided to tell him that because he doesn't let me date any boys, that boys want me more. He laughed and said that that wasn't true, and that most likely I was just provoking these boys. Obviously, this really upset me. My dad was always really controlling. When I turned 16, I decided I wanted to get my own job. This way I could have some more freedom and just meet more people outside of school. I started working at a local restaurant and quickly made friends with everyone who was working there. They were all pretty much my age, especially one boy. Let's call him Rick. Rick and I hit it off right away. I had a huge crush on him instantly, and I could tell that he liked me too. But of course, my strict parents were always present in my mind, so I tried my best to stay away from Rick just so that I wouldn't develop any feelings. Which I already had, who am I kidding? One day, Rick asked me if I wanted to take my break with him, and I said yes. He sat in his car for 30 minutes and just talked the entire time. I started falling in love with him. We talked so much, and he was so kind and so funny. The next few days at work, we were basically inseparable. Finally, at the end of the week, he asked me if I wanted to be his girlfriend, and I said yes. Without a moment of hesitation, I said yes, knowing that my parents would not want that at all. So here's when I told him that we needed to keep this a secret. He wanted to just speak to my parents, but I begged him not to. Thankfully, he understood. The only time we were able to spend together was at work. And we did this for a full year. When I turned 17, my parents insisted that I quit my job so that I could focus on school. I pretty much had to listen to them, so I did. This meant that Rick and I barely ever saw each other. Instead, I decided to sneak him into my house every single night. Part 2 is up. So I started sneaking my boyfriend into my room every single night. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My parents had literally no idea. I snuck my boyfriend Rick into my room every single night for a full year. The only time we ever got close to getting caught, the smoke alarm in our house went off, and as soon as we heard it, Rick jumped out through my window. My room was on the first floor, so this wasn't really an issue at all. I finally graduated from high school and started going to college. It became way easier to hide my relationship from my parents because I was living in a dorm. Rick would come visit me every single weekend, and my parents would come to visit me every now and then. Even when I was in college, you guys, my parents were still super strict. So one day I decided to ask my dad when I could have a boyfriend. He said when I was living under my own roof and paying my own bills. So the following year, that's exactly what I did. I was able to get a good job in my field, and so did Rick. So we put our money together and his parents helped us to get an apartment. But here's the thing, I didn't want my parents to know that I had a boyfriend this whole time. So instead, I told them that Rick was my roommate who I met in college, and that I finally just decided that I wanted my own freedom. My dad was really proud of me for taking the initiative, which was crazy to me. He said he was proud of me. My mom, on the other hand, definitely did not want me moving in with some guy. So I invited Rick over to my parents' house. They met him for a little bit and they actually liked him. Fast forward 6 years, Rick and I are married, and my parents don't know that he was my boyfriend for 4 years. They think that we started dating after we moved in together. I kind of want to tell my parents, but I'm not sure. I think they would get really upset and possibly not speak to me. What do you think I should do? Story time about how I caught my mom hooking up with my guy best friend. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My best friend and I have known each other for 7 years. Let's call him Mark. Mark and I met when we were in school, and we have been inseparable since then. Everyone's constantly telling us that we should date, but we're not into each other like that. Last year, my parents started fighting a lot because my dad found out that my mom cheated on him. And she cheated on him with my dad's best friend. My mom's the kind of woman that constantly seeks attention from men. And growing up, she weirdly competed with me. Like anytime I liked a boy, she would flirt with him in front of me. So yeah, my mom's not the best when it comes to stuff like that. So when my dad found out that my mom was cheating on him, I basically just wanted to keep the peace, and I convinced my dad to not get a divorce. Huge mistake. Fast forward to 2 months ago. Mark was just about to turn 20, so I had been planning a birthday party for him. Because of COVID, I was only inviting our immediate family and close friends. And of course, my mom had to interject and wanted to help me plan everything. I told her several times I didn't need her help, but she insisted. Let me just say this, before any of this happened, it never occurred to me that my mom was even attracted to Mark. I saw him as like a brother to me, so I assumed that she would see him the same way. My mom and dad kept arguing every single day. Mark would come over and he would just let me vent to him. The day of Mark's birthday party is when I started noticing some weird things. My mom, of course, had to drink a lot of champagne, so she was getting a little tipsy. She insisted on dancing with Mark and like making this big scene, so they started dancing. More people joined the dance floor and it became like a real party. A few hours later, I see my mom and Mark sitting on the couch, but my mom is crying her eyeballs out, complaining about my dad, and Mark is just there listening to her. I mean, she's putting him in a weird position. I literally had to peel my mom off of Mark and take her home and put her into bed. Thankfully, Mark just thought it was funny, so he didn't get upset. A few weeks later, I come home and find Mark in the kitchen with my mom. Once again, my mom is drinking and complaining about my dad. And once again, Mark is just listening to her. But here's the thing. My mom was standing there in a bikini, supposedly ready to get in the pool. Part 2 is... So my mom is standing there in a bikini trying to seduce my guy best friend. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It's sent to me on Instagram. I asked my mom nicely to go put on some clothes and she refused. So I grabbed Mark's hand and told him to come upstairs with me. I asked him what was going on between him and my mom and he said nothing. And he even said that I was ridiculous for even suggesting something like that. And I believed him, so I let it go. A few days later, my mom is dressed up all sexy in a red tight dress, supposedly making breakfast for my dad and I. But my dad had already left for work, and I was going to school, so she knew that. I had the feeling that she had Mark coming over and she didn't want me to know. So I got in my car and told her I was leaving for school. Instead, I waited around the corner and I saw Mark driving up to the house. I waited for about 10 minutes and then I quietly pulled into the driveway and opened the door. And what do you know, my mom is sitting on the countertop making out with my guy best friend. And they were going at it. Like if I hadn't gotten there, it would have happened, you know? I slammed the door and my mom jumps off the counter. Mark pretends that nothing's wrong and tells me that he has to go to school. But of course, I didn't let him leave. That's when my mom told me that they were in love. And what do you know, Mark confirmed it. That's when my mom basically begged me not to tell my dad anything and that her and Mark were going to continue seeing each other. I told my mom I'd keep the secret, but instead I drove straight to my dad's job and told him everything. He went straight to his lawyer and filed for divorce. When he confronted her, my mom basically said that I was lying and that I had for some reason made everything up. Mark, on the other hand, is totally in love with her, but she's telling him to leave her alone. So she also broke his heart. He doesn't even want to go back to school and he's begging me to get my mom and him back together. I told him that that would never happen because my mom is never going to leave my dad. My dad makes a lot of money and she has no job. He provides her a lifestyle that Mark could never. Now here's the thing, my mom's accusing me of being a terrible daughter for telling my dad, but how could I not tell my dad? I mean, am I the asshole here? I doubt it, but what do you guys think? What should I do? Story time about how my neighbor tried to unalive me. 4 years ago, my husband and I had just moved into a new neighborhood. We were newly married and were trying to have kids right away. My husband and I were also really social, so we would invite our neighbors over and host parties. We had a really big, beautiful house with a pool, so we always took advantage. Mostly everyone on our block would come to our get-togethers, but there was always this one couple that never showed up. I didn't think anything of it until one of my neighbors told me not to invite them to any other event in the future. When I asked her why, she said the police would go off into their house, and that the husband and the family was suspected of abusing the entire family. Obviously, after this, I stopped inviting them. Every single day, I would go on walks with my husband. Well, one night, my husband decided to stay home, so I went by myself. I decided to change my route and walk in front of the neighbor's house, the one everyone was scared of, and as soon as I turned down the street, I saw a man by the window. I looked away really fast because I didn't want him to think that I was staring, although I was. Suddenly, his front door opens and he comes outside. And all he says is, "You're the new neighbor, right?" I simply replied, "Yes, and nice to meet you." He stared at me for a few seconds, didn't say anything, and closed his door. I obviously thought this was strange. I kept walking, but a few minutes later, I noticed that he was right behind me, and something told me to run back home, which I did. That's when I realized he knew where I lived. Part 2 is up. Part 2 of how my neighbor tried to unalive me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I sent me on Instagram. I ran back home as quickly as I could. I told my husband that the neighbor followed me home, but he told me to just forget about it. A few days later, I come home from running some errands. I get out of my car, and out of the corner of my eye, I see my neighbor standing behind a tree, and I could tell that he's looking at me. I decided to just ignore it because I didn't actually want to have to make conversation. Instead, I grabbed the groceries and walked into the house. I began closing the door, but he pushed his way in. I backed away and asked him what he wanted. He asked me if my husband was home. And no, my husband was not home, but I said yes. Then he looks around and asks me if he could get a little tour of the house. He also said that he really wanted to see the pool. Okay, I know what you're gonna think, but I was so scared I thought that if I just showed him the house, he would leave. I walk him over to the backyard and he starts looking around. That's when he asked me if we had any security cameras. My hands and knees started to shake, and once again I lied and said yes. He started looking around some more and said, "Nope, you definitely don't have any." I told him I needed to leave the house and if he could just leave. He starts to laugh and tells me that I should be nicer to him. He ripped my phone out of my hands and threw it into the pool. Instantly, I sprinted away from him. He grabbed my hair and I fell really hard to the ground. Part 3 is up. Part 3 of how my neighbor tried to unalive me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I was sending me on Instagram. He pulled my hair hard and I fell to the ground. That's when I just started kicking as hard as I could. I heard him scream and he fell back. I got up and ran straight back into the house and locked the door behind me. He came up to the door and started banging on it. He told me if I didn't let him in that he would break the door. That's when he grabbed a chair and started throwing it against the glass. Luckily, the windows are hurricane proof, so he couldn't come in. I called 911 and then my husband. I went around the house locking every single door and window. He would just follow me from window to window yelling at me. He told me he just wanted to talk to me and that I was overreacting. Finally, I could hear the sirens around the corner. And of course, he started running away. Finally, the cops found him. His pockets, they found zip ties, and his car was loaded with rope and different things. Apparently, he planned on taking me to the woods. He's now in prison, but I'm so scared that he'll get out. What should I do? Story time about how I beat up my stalker of 4 years. When I was 18, I booked a major campaign. I started modeling at the age of 10, and it was a really big deal for me. This happened in a country where women are not treated very well. When my campaign came out, there were billboards of me everywhere in the city. My face was plastered on the internet and on social media too. Now from this, my Instagram grew a lot. Overnight, I went from having 6,000 followers to 40,000 followers. So by the end of the week, I had almost 100,000 followers. Again, this was a huge deal for me, and I was really happy about it. But things started getting really weird when I started checking my DMs. I had about 40 DMs from one guy alone. The rest of the DMs were thirst traps, but this guy was different. He was becoming obsessive literally overnight. Every other message was about how beautiful I was and how he wanted to marry me. Instead of replying, I decided to ignore his messages. From this campaign, I started getting even more modeling jobs. And I also started getting paid to post stuff on Instagram. I was super happy. When I checked my DMs again, I noticed that he was messaging me even more. Once again, I ignored every single one of his messages. But after 4 days, he started getting really angry. Started commenting bitch on all of my pictures. Got to the point where I had to tell my modeling agency and they just told me to ignore him too. A few days later, I opened his DMs only to see a picture of my house. Part 2 of how I beat up my stalker of 4 years. When I opened his DM, I saw that he sent me a picture of my own house. And this meant he knew where I lived. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I was sending me on Instagram. Once again, I told my modeling agency, and again, they told me to just ignore it. But it terrified me that he knew where I lived. Luckily, I lived in a really big apartment building, so I don't think he knew exactly what floor I lived on. But I took a chance and I sent him a message asking him politely to leave me alone. Believe it or not, this went on for 4 years. I would tell him to leave me alone and he would just come back with more things to say. During those 4 years, I did travel a lot for modeling, so it didn't bother me that much. Not until I got pregnant. He actually sent me a picture of me pregnant. That's when he told me that I had betrayed him and that I was cheating on him. One day I'm at my apartment, and yes, I had already met a man at this time and we were engaged. My fiance was out at work. I decided to take some time off of modeling since I was pregnant. Suddenly I get a knock on my door. I opened the door to a stranger I had never seen before. Obviously at the time I didn't know it was my stalker because I didn't know what he looked like. That's when he hands me a package and he tells me that I must have left it downstairs. I told him I hadn't ordered anything and then he asked if he could come in. I said no, but he pushed his way in. When he grabbed my hand and started begging for forgiveness. And he confessed that he had been sending me the messages for 4 years. Started yelling at him to leave, but he wouldn't. He tried to kiss my pregnant belly and asked me if it was his son. And that's when I just started kicking and punching him. And I didn't stop until he was out the door. When I looked at his face, he was bleeding and scratched all over. Neighbor had come out and had already called the cops, thank God. Cops arrested him and he was taken away. They were only able to hold him for 2 weeks. Apparently he had not broken any laws. This man is out there free. What should I do?
Had to leave, I just couldn't bear to stay. Nothing's back in its place for me anyway. I wanna see what's hiding across the sea. If there is something out there for me. Take a train ride to camp, catch a flight. Travel daytime into the night. All alone, grab a backpack and light. That's what life should be all about.
Okay, so story time about how I walked in on my brother giving my boyfriend head. Yeah, not a good time in my life. Anyway, so a little background information. I was 16 and a sophomore in high school, and I had been dating this guy who we are going to call Jack. He was honestly one of the sweetest boys that I had ever met. Honestly, like, he was the perfect boyfriend. Him and I had started dating the summer before our freshman year in high school. So unlike everybody else who had a boyfriend or girlfriend at our age, him and I were super close, pretty much because him and I started dating so early. Like, we pretty much had 2 years on everybody. So I thought I was winning in life. Not to mention, his parents loved me and my parents absolutely adored him. And so did all of my siblings. Oh, the irony. And him and I were honestly like the perfect couple to everybody else. I would say him and I encouraged each other to do better in school, to just do things that were good for our futures. I don't know, shit like that, right? My friends had thought him and I were the perfect couple, except for my 2 best friends. They had always said that there was something a little bit off about him and the way he would act. And I'm not gonna lie, he wasn't like most guys, okay? And that was part of the reason why I liked him. So honestly, I just always thought that they were jealous of him and I because he was such a great guy, and him and I have been together longer than any of their relationships even lasted. Honestly, they would point out everything that seemed to be wrong in my relationship, you know, because they were such great friends. No, I'm kidding. They were really good friends. They were just honestly looking out for me at the end of the day, but I did not realize that. But one of the things they would especially point out that they said was weird in our relationship was the fact that he would hang out with his friends more than he hung out with me, which in all honesty, I mean, they weren't wrong about that, but I thought that it was normal. I thought that it was just things that normal teenage boys do. They want to hang out with their friends. That shouldn't be a problem. I mean, now, there was one weird thing that him and his friends would do that did actually bother me a lot more than I would like to admit. He would kiss his friends on the mouth, and it wasn't like he was making out with them. It was pretty much, yeah, that he would just kiss them on the mouth. and I was very uncomfortable with that. And when I would bring up the fact that I was uncomfortable with it, he would totally disregard my feelings and make it all about him. All about him. He would be like, we're friends, are you serious right now? That's what you're gonna get mad at out of all things? It's such a double standards between girls and guys. Girls can kiss their best friends, but guys can't kiss their best friends. Pretty much just playing a victim, because I had never kissed one of my girlfriends on the lips or kissed any girl or anyone else except for my boyfriend, because I'm in a relationship. So, you know, of course I try to tell him that makes me uncomfortable. He blows it off pretty much, and that was the end of the argument. And then my friends would bring up the fact that he never wants to do the nasty with me, which again, they weren't wrong, but every time we reached this part in the conversation, I would shut that shit down, because one, I was embarrassed, and two, they were right. I was really bothered about the fact that there was like no physical touch in our relationship. A lot of the time I would feel extremely insecure by this and unattractive, unlovable, even though it sounds very over dramatic, because he would never hug me, never hold my hand, never wanted to cuddle with me when we were watching a movie or anything like that, you know. And I kid you not, every time that I would bring this up to him, he would have an excuse every single time. Every single time. I want to say that this is TMI low-key, but within the whole time that we've been together, we had only did the nasty like 3 times, okay? 3 times. And during those 3 times, I had never felt more disconnected from him than I ever had before. His excuses would kind of be along the lines of, oh, I have a headache. Oh, like, I'm tired from the gym. Right now isn't a good time. This, that, and the next. It was like every single fucking time. But of course, I would respect his boundaries, and I wouldn't, you know, like, push at it any further if he said one of those things. But then later, if I would bring it up, he would be like, that's not true, you know, like, I do want to do the nasty with you, you know, I just wasn't feeling good yesterday, this, that, and the next. Yeah, pretty much excuses. Excuse after excuse after excuse after excuse. And here's the thing, if I always wanted to do the nasty, that was one thing, you know? But sometimes I would ask him if he wanted to do it just because I wanted to feel loved by him, which sounds really pathetic. But yeah, I just pretty much felt unloved by my boyfriend that I had been with for almost 3 years. Well, that being said, red flags were going off in my head left and right, because I was like, if he doesn't want to do anything relationship-wise with me, who else is he getting it from? So this put me in a manic, psychopath kind of state of mind. I searched through all of his social medias, his text messages, looking for any type of evidence that he was into another girl, he was talking to another girl, but I went through everything and nothing was there. Which I know this sounds weird, but that even made me more upset than I was before. Because one, I have never done anything like that, like, you know, going through his phone. And also, if he wasn't cheating on me, then maybe he just really didn't like me anymore. And to be honest, I could see that being the problem, because we didn't talk as much as we used to. We didn't spend any time together like we used to. So I decided to tell him that I was like really upset about the fact that our relationship was just like in shambles. And he was like, I'm sorry, I never realized, you know, I thought everything was going great between us, you know, I'll try harder. And that made me happy, because I was like, you know, a little bit reassured. I was like, okay, you know, he thought nothing was wrong, so why did I think anything was wrong, right? So the fact that he was willing to try harder made me feel better, until it ended up same shit, different day again. Don't you love that whenever men are like, yeah, like, I promise I'll change, like, I'll do better, and like they do it for like a day, and then they're like, well, you know what, it's time for like my like 2-week-long break until I get yelled at again. We just love that, don't we? But anyways, back to the story. There was one thing that was a little bit different this time. Soccer season had started up, and I would come home every day at 4:30, and school usually ended for everybody else around 2:30. Well, every day that I would come home from soccer, Jack would already be at my house. And then he would hang out with me for about 20 minutes and then say that he had to go home to do homework or some BS excuse. At first, I thought this was really cute because I was like, OMG, he wants to spend time with me. Like, oh my God, my boyfriend is perfect. Yay. Wrong. And I found out that this wasn't really true because my mom had came back from the grocery store the one night and she was like, oh, like, did you see Jake today? And I was like, yeah, you know, but like he had to go home, he had to do homework. And she was like, oh, he was like waiting for you here for about an hour. So at that point, I'm like, what the fuck? He knows that I come home at 4:30 after soccer practice. So a little weird if you ask me.
Funny. Yes, but not funny, haha. Funny weird.
So this made me 10 times more mad than I already was. So of course, me trying to be, you know, kind of an adult, I decided to talk to him about it. Because I wasn't gonna throw almost 3 years down the drain because he wanted to play games. So I had talked to him about it again. And this time was weird because he begged for me not to leave him and that he was really, really, really gonna try harder this time. So can you guess what I did? I took him back. So at this point, obviously, even my best friends are pissed off at me for giving him another chance. Like, you know your friends are pissed off at you when they don't even give you advice anymore. That has to do with your relationship. Well, let's just say the third time's a charm because, finally, I started to learn the truth. And yeah, that's pretty much all there is to it. Okay, everybody, that is So later on that week, I was supposed to go to a party with my girlfriends and it was at this senior's house, but I was supposed to ride there with Jack. So I got all dressed up, I did my makeup, and as soon as I walked downstairs, my parents stopped me and they're like, where do you think you're going? We have to be at your grandparents at 8 in the morning tomorrow. So I was not allowed to go, of course. So at this point, Jack is already on his way to get me and I just tell him to go to the party by himself and I would see him later because we talked about me maybe sneaking him in the house. Well, I guess you can say I did see him later that night, but it wasn't whenever he snuck over my house. It was whenever I saw him on some guy's story kissing another guy. Oh, I'm sorry, not kissing. No, I could tell the difference between whenever he kisses his friends and, you know, whenever he's making out with somebody. He was making out with some guy. This guy took a video and was like, yo, like, you're wildin', and it's a video of my boyfriend and some guy making out. So that was like awesome, you know, love that for me. So what do? I go ahead and I am blowing up his phone. Everything keeps going to voicemail. I was texting him, none of my texts were going through. So at this point, I'm either thinking that his phone died or he blocked me. And at this point, I am extremely, extremely, extremely pissed off. But of course, in my head, I'm like telling myself that this isn't real, even though there's a video. I'm telling myself it isn't real. And I think the reason why I was telling myself that was because he always had excuses for whenever, you know, this shit would happen, anything would happen, to be honest. So I was just really hoping that he had like a good excuse to explain what the was going on. Because, you know, there was always an excuse whenever he would, quote, kiss his friends for fun. So the next day I wake up on straight demon time. Like, I went and I told my mom that I wasn't feeling good, so I wasn't gonna be able to go up and see my grandparents, you know. And I really would never lie to my parents, so there wasn't any reason for them not to believe me. So they let me stay home. And as soon as they left, I hopped in my car, went and picked up my girlfriends, and we drove to his house. And because my friends went to the party last night, they were telling me what was going on, and they were like, yeah, dude, that was definitely more than just like a kiss. They were like, he was straight, like, you know, tongue making out with this guy there, and he was with this dude literally all night. So once I got there, I knocked on the door. His mom answered. She sent him down. You know, we were on his porch pretty much, and I was like, you cheated on me last night. And he was like, no, like, I swear to God, it was a dare, you know, like, we were all playing truth or dare. I'm not gay. I was like, I don't give a fuck if you're gay or not. You cheated on me. I was like, that is cheating. And he's like, that's not even cheating. He was like, it would have been cheating if, you know, like, I had kissed a girl or something. Like, I'm starting to think this kid doesn't get that Kissing anybody, I don't give a fuck if it's a boy, a girl, or what it is. It's cheating. Like, holy shit. So because I was like really pissed off and he was not accepting the fact that he cheated on me, I left and I dropped all my girlfriends off. I went home. I'm still super upset about the whole situation. And a few days later, he asked if he can come over and talk to me. So he comes over and he's like, listen, like, I realized, you know, like, what I did was wrong. I didn't see it in that way, honestly. He was like, no more bullshit. And I was like, period, no more bullshit. Like, we're good now, I guess.
I don't want to learn any more life lessons. My character is developed.
Oh Lord, please help this girl. And he says to me again, I'm not gay. Like, I don't care. I really don't care. But he admitted that he realized it was wrong, and that's what it was. Like, even my friends told me that they thought he was gay a little bit, or at least bi, because he would just be really touchy with his friends, but I thought that's how most teenage boys were, to be honest. But yeah, I pretty much refused to believe it. Until one day, soccer ended early the one day because it had started thunderstorming really bad. So I was coming home about like 2 hours earlier than I should have because we got there and like 5 minutes later, you know. Anyways, now this wouldn't have been a weird day if when I got home, nobody was home, okay? But I am driving down my street and all of a sudden I see Jake's car in my driveway. So I park a little bit down the road so he would not hear me pull into the driveway. And my thought process behind all of this was either one, he was planning a surprise because our 3-year anniversary was coming up like less than a week, or he was planning to break up with me. Usually whenever my boyfriend and I have serious talks, he is like, we usually just talk in his car because we really can get no privacy inside of my house or his house. So I am like crouching around the driveway and shit, and he isn't in his car. So I'm like, okay, that's a good sign. And my boyfriend also does know the code to get in because whenever he sneaks in at night, yeah. So anyways, I go around to the back door of the house and I sneak in. I don't know what I was gonna do. I like wanted to surprise slash scare him a little bit. So I go to check the basement. He's not there. I check the living room, dining room, kitchen, nothing. So then I go upstairs to my room because I'm like, okay, maybe he's in my bedroom. He's not in there either. But then I hear coming from the upstairs, Fortnite, like somebody's playing Fortnite and the TV's really loud. So now I'm like, what the fuck? So there's the first floor, obviously, with the kitchen, dining room, everything else, living room, blah, blah, blah. Above that is my room, my sister's room, and my other sister's room. And then above that is the attic, and that's where my older brother's room was. And this was a little bit weird because my brother was supposed to still be in Colorado with his friends, and he wasn't supposed to be getting home until like 3 o'clock in the morning that night. / tomorrow morning. And anytime that Jack is over, my brother does tell him that he can, you know, go upstairs and play his Xbox or his PlayStation or whatever he wants. But my boyfriend doesn't like to play video games. So I try to open the door and scare him, but the door is locked. How convenient. And the lock to the doors were like one of those ones that had like just like a flat thing in it, and you could like stick, you know, a quarter or your nail in and you could twist it and unlock it. So I go back downstairs, I get a quarter, and I unlock the door and I walk in on my 21-year-old brother giving head to my 17-year-old boyfriend. Amazing. At this point, I'm completely breakdown. I'm a mess. Jack grabs all of his clothes, runs out the house as I'm throwing shit at him while he's leaving. And my brother completely just pushes me out of the room, locks the door, and I couldn't even talk to my brother about it because he would just play the victim like he always did. So I call my parents. They were both at work, but I told them the whole situation of what's going on. They were livid. They came home quick as hell to help me deal with the situation, which I was very thankful for because like I was like a freaking mess, like an absolute shit show. That being said, my parents told my brother that it was time for him to find his own apartment. He's 21 years old. He needs to either move to where his college was or whatever. He ended up moving out like a week later. My sisters and I didn't talk to him for the longest time, except for my oldest sister. She was like 25. And it wasn't like my family and I weren't accepting of my brother and who he was, because he came out to us whenever he was 13. We all accepted him. There was like no like weirdness after that, really. As for Jack and I, after that, we didn't talk. I didn't want to talk to him. I was embarrassed. Everybody already knew about the situation, to be honest. And my parents also told my brother, they were like, listen, like, you're lucky that like we're not going to tell his parents, because if he were to press charges or his parents wanted to press charges, that would be a whole nother thing. Because also Jack's parents weren't accepting of like anything he did. Like, I remember the one year I wanted him to join the talent show with me, you know, or do this play with me. They said absolutely not. He would not be doing that. Fast forward a few years later to present day, today, I started talking to my brother again. To be honest, it's just one of those things. It happened. He apologized. Him and Jack, though, have been dating ever since. And my parents were obviously super pissed off at Jack and my brother for the whole situation, but it's kind of like one of those things now where Jack feels more accepted in my family than he does in his own family. So I'm happy for that, and I'm really happy that him and my brother have found each other, because they really love each other.
Story time about how I hooked up with my stepbrother. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I repeat, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My dad and I moved to a new town after he got divorced from my mom. The plan would be that I would split my time with my mom and my dad. Now, with the divorce, I actually got really depressed, and it really did affect me. Also, I had just turned 18 at the time, and I didn't really want to go to college, so I didn't know what to do with my life. My mom asked me if I wanted to go on a trip to Europe with her, and I said yes. So my mom and I traveled for about 2 months. When I got home, I decided to go spend time with my dad for a few months. Well, guess what? He already had a new girlfriend. And of course, this affected me really, really badly. And my mom too. Her and I were both surprised that he moved on so quickly. His new girlfriend was okay. She was much younger than my mom, but still older than me. But here's the thing, she had 4 kids. She invited me and my dad to come over for dinner so that we could get to know her kids a bit better. Mind you, I had never met them at this point. I had just gotten back from Europe. So I go over to their house for dinner, and as soon as I walk in, I am greeted by the 2 most beautiful guys I have ever seen in my entire life. They were both in their early 20s, and like I said, I was 18. The other 2 kids were teenagers. Throughout the dinner, I couldn't stop staring at both of these guys. I was like really trying not to be obvious, but I had just never seen such beautiful guys. It turns out one of them was actually a model, and the other one was a bodybuilder. So you can imagine what they might have looked like. Also, throughout the dinner, they kept making eye contact with me. It was almost like they were competing. After dinner, my dad and I went back to his place. This is when my dad asked me what I really thought of his girlfriend. And I told him that I didn't think he should have moved on that quickly, but at the same time, she was actually a good person. She obviously cared about her kids, and they had a pretty good life. That's when my dad told me that he was going to ask her to marry him. They had not been together very long, but I said, okay. Of course, my dad asked me to plan the whole thing with him. He proposed, and of course, she said yes. And this is when it hit me. These 2 really attractive guys were now going to be my stepbrothers. Awkward. This also meant that I started hanging out more and more at their house. My dad and I would go over for dinners, we would all spend the day in the pool, and basically just hang out. And this meant that I started getting to know my stepbrothers a little better. Right away, I could tell that they were starting to flirt with me while we were all together and separately. Of course, I was totally single, so I was like, well, you know, whatever. After dinner one night, my dad asked me if I was interested in one of them. And I was like, no, Dad. He told me that I couldn't stop staring at the guys and that I needed to calm down. Oh my God. I was totally blushing and I told him that nothing was going to happen and not to worry. I decided to put some space between me and the guys. One of them actually decided to reach out on Instagram and ask me why I was being so cold. Obviously, I didn't tell him that my dad told me to stay away from them, so I just pretended like I didn't know what he was talking about. That's when he asked me if I wanted to join him and his friends to go to the movies. I couldn't resist and I said yes. While we were watching the movie, he actually grabbed onto my hand and kissed it. And he kissed me, part 2. That's when my stepbrother grabbed my hand and kissed me in the movie theater. I was totally shocked. I knew that he had been flirting with me, but I didn't think that he was going to take it that far as to kiss me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. I repeat, this is not my story time. By the way, we were with 2 of his other friends. So these guys knew that I was his stepsister. After the movie, we all went back to his car and they drove me home. We didn't speak for the rest of the night. Obviously, I was already falling in love with him. I mean, he was so cute, so nice, and he liked me. The following day, my dad and I went over to his girlfriend's house, aka the mother of my stepbrother. That's when my stepbrother came up to me and grabbed my hand. I pulled it away as soon as I could because I thought someone had seen us. Luckily, the coast was clear. He took me to his bedroom and we just made out, while the rest of the family is downstairs having food. After about 10 minutes, we decided to go back downstairs. My stepbrother sat next to me and underneath the table, he kept grabbing my knee. I was terrified that someone would see this. I mean, it's almost like he didn't care if we got caught. After that, my dad and I went home. And about 30 minutes after we got home, my stepbrother calls me and tells me that he's out front. I told him there was no way I could let him in and that he should just go home. And before I knew it, he had snuck in through my window. This is when I realized that I needed him to calm down because if we got caught, my dad would get really upset. I told him that he shouldn't have done that and that he needed to go home. That's when he confessed that he was in love with me. I mean, we had known each other for a few months, but we had only kissed like twice. He told me from the moment he set his eyes on me, he couldn't stop thinking about me. And he told me that him and his stepbrother actually fought over who would get to date me. I was actually flattered, but also concerned. That's when he told me that we should just date and we shouldn't care what our parents think. At first I said no, but then he kept trying to convince me. Suddenly, my dad knocks on my door and asks me who I'm talking to. Part 3 is up. As my stepbrother is confessing to me that he's in love with me, my dad knocks on the door. My stomach sank really quick. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. I repeat, this is not my story time. My dad knocks on the door and asks me who I'm talking to. That's when my stepbrother runs into my closet and just hides. I opened the door and explained to my dad that I was on the phone with a friend. He said okay and just left. But I could tell that he was suspicious. I let my stepbrother out of the closet and told him to leave. That's when he said that he wanted to stay over. Oh my God, I could have just died at that moment. That's when my dad opens the door and catches him. That's when my dad chased him around the house and told him to leave. I was beyond mortified. Oh, and I forgot to mention, my dad and my stepmom were already married. So he calls her and tells her everything that happened. Of course, I denied that he and I did anything, but my dad was not believing me. He told me that while I still lived under his roof, I had to follow his rules. And that meant not dating my stepbrother. The very next day, my stepbrother calls me and asks me to move in with him. He told me that we should get our own apartment and that way we can be happy together. Honestly, I didn't even know what to say because I wasn't in love with him like he said he was in love with me. Of course, this made my dad even more angry. He warned my stepbrother to stay away from me. Obviously, this is causing problems between him and his new wife. And yeah, I feel really bad. Now that I haven't seen my stepbrother in about a week, I'm starting to realize that maybe I am in love with him. Because I can't stop thinking about him and all I want to do is spend time with him and call him. So I'm seriously considering moving in with him, but I'm not sure how this is going to affect my dad or his new marriage. I mean, it's not like we're blood related and I'm already 18. So my dad kind of has to accept this, but he's so stubborn. Now my stepbrother wants me to be his girlfriend and I don't know what to say. I really need some advice. Help. time about how my husband and my dad got into a fist fight on our wedding day. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I was sending me on Instagram. My dad is in the military, therefore he is super strict. He's never liked any of my boyfriends and especially my fiance. My fiance is a musician, so he sometimes doesn't have a lot of income, so my dad thinks that he's absolutely lazy. I have a really good job and I always end up making a lot more than my fiance. This means that I have to make up for his lack of money. So usually I end up paying for most of the bills and my fiance ends up paying for about a third of our rent. And we do live in a nice fancy apartment. I mean, we've got a pool, a sauna, there's a bunch of amenities, and most of the time my fiance only gives me about $500 towards rent. My dad knows all of these issues, and trust me, it is an issue for me because I want him to be able to provide for me and our babies whenever I get pregnant, but it really irks my dad. But of course, it really bothers my dad. Every time my fiance and I go over to my parents for dinner, my dad is always making comments about how he doesn't earn enough money, and he asks him like, how are you going to provide for your family? And that's when my fiance and him usually get into a fight. Our wedding day was quickly approaching, so I wanted to keep a distance between my fiance and my dad. Everything was good up until the reception. My now husband and I were saying hello to friends. Out of nowhere, my dad tackles my husband down. That's when all hell breaks loose. Part 2 is up. Part 2 of how my husband and my dad got into a fist fight on our wedding day. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I was sending me on Instagram. So my dad body slams my new husband onto the ground. Then of course, all of my husband's friends come attack my dad and try to pull him off of my husband. By the way, my dad is super strong. Like I said in part 1, he's in the army, so he's built and super strong. My dad and my husband were pummeling each other. They were even kicking each other on our wedding day. And yeah, I'm in my wedding dress crying while everyone else is going crazy. Luckily, I invited a friend and her boyfriend is a cop. So he went up to my dad, who was clearly the stronger one in the fight, and was able to restrain him. When they were finally separated, my dad started yelling at my husband, calling him a liar and a cheater. And when I heard my dad say that, my stomach dropped. I knew that my dad had my back and that he probably found out something about my husband. My dad grabs my hand and pulls my mom into a separate room. Then he shows me pictures of my husband with another woman in a parking lot. That's when my dad explained to me that he didn't trust my fiance, so he decided to hire a private investigator to follow him around. Remember in part 1 I said that I was paying for almost everything in our relationship? My dad really hated this, and he was convinced that instead of going to work, my fiance was spending time with another woman. And guess what? He was right. Of course, my dad felt really bad about causing a whole scene, but that's when he told me that we had to annul the marriage. I honestly didn't know what to do at the time, so I told my dad that I needed to speak to my husband. My friend's boyfriend, the cop, was there the whole time. He took my dad out of the room and then brought in my husband. Of course, my mom stayed in the room with me to have some backup, and we grilled my husband for about 20 minutes. First, he denied everything, but when I showed him the picture that my dad showed me, he said it was just a friend. Of course, my mom and I weren't buying it. That's when he finally confessed that it was his old girlfriend and that they were just saying goodbye for one last time. That's when he showed me all the text messages between him and his ex, and everything was pretty innocent. I asked him why he didn't tell me that he was going to go see his ex, and he told me that he just didn't want any drama with my dad. The cop brought my dad back in the room. I asked him to stay inside while my dad and my husband and I talked. I explained to my dad everything that happened, but he wasn't buying his story. My dad kept saying that we just needed to get a divorce. My husband was crying and begging me to forgive him. Then my dad started attacking him again. Once again, the cop had to restrain him and he put him in a chokehold. Part 3 of how my dad attacked my husband on our wedding day. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I was sending me on Instagram. My dad attacked my husband for a second time. Luckily, my friend's boyfriend, who was a cop, was there and was trying to manage the situation. Basically, we called off the entire reception. So $7,000 right down the drain. My husband and I were supposed to leave that night to Greece. I told my parents we should still go on the honeymoon and they agreed. But obviously my dad was really upset about it. But while we were in Greece, I caught my husband texting his ex again. This woman texted him saying that she missed him. Then he told her about the fight he got into with my dad. Then she said that my whole family is crazy and that he shouldn't have married into it. I confronted my husband and he told me that he needed her as a friend and that I just needed to deal with it. Then I told him that I was the one that paid for basically everything in our relationship, including most of our wedding and our honeymoon, and that he needed to be grateful to me and to my family. That's when he said that he would never speak to my family again. That's when I told him that the relationship wasn't going to work then. Now that we're back home, my parents really want me to get a divorce, but I'm not sure. Obviously, he has feelings for his ex and so does she. But I mean, I still love him. Why should I lose out? My husband is being super distant and barely talks to me. My dad is upset with me too because I haven't gotten a divorce. Should I just file for divorce? What should I do?
Story time. Thank you, Tiffany, for sending me the story. So Tiffany and her sister were at the beach facing away from the water, and it was getting dark, the tide was coming in, and they heard these crying noises that kind of sounded like they were coming from the ocean, so they called the police, to make sure everything's okay. So the police show up, they check everywhere, and they don't find anything, so they send out boats to go out even further, just in case somebody's all the way out there. So this started late at night, but this was a party night, so this went all the way till 6 a.m., and everybody had pretty much left. Tiffany and her sister had stayed a little bit longer, and right then comes a woman running out of the alleyway from the nightclub area. She's visibly upset, completely drenched in water as if she had gone swimming, and so Tiffany kind of finds this weird, so she calls the police again, and right as that happens, the girl runs onto the pier and jumps off. Tiffany and her sister are freaking out, the police boats and everything show up and they send them home. A few days later, the police contact Tiffany and ask to meet up so they can ask questions about that night. So the police told Tiffany that the crying came from the woman that was jumping off the pier. She had done this multiple times that night, swimming far out so that the current and the rough waters could drag her under and kill her.